Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in cyberspace. I'm speaking from Cape Town. We just heard a few hours ago that our lockdown period is going to be extended by another 2 weeks, which will make it 5 weeks in total. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you. I've decided that for my presentation, I'll be taking a very, if you like, almost practical approach and really having a look at the future of South Africa from the perspective of both before the virus and how, in any way, future prospects have changed since the start of this epidemic. So my agenda is very simple. I'll take you back what seems like a long, long time ago, but it's actually only about 6 weeks ago, to February of this year, when in this country we were getting very concerned about the future of the economy and the future of the country. But now when we look back, those not so happy prospects don't seem too bad, actually. I'll then say a bit more about the nature of this country's potential economic recovery, given the reality of the virus, four very simple scenarios. And then ask the question, what then? Once the dust has settled, what awaits the country, obviously the world as well, but what awaits South Africa looking beyond just this current crisis, this current pandemic? I think I should say before I start that any economic prospect for this country, given the virus, even the best case scenario uses the word recession. So the real question is, how severe will the recession be and how long will it last? So allow me to take you back to, as I said, just a few weeks ago. Taking a particular economic point of view to start off with, what you see there is economic growth in this country going back quite some time. And going back quite some time, just to inform you or perhaps remind you that this country, South Africa, has had a very strange, awkward, and in many cases, unfortunate history. If I point to the red bars on this graph, it shows the growth from the mid-70s to the early 90s really was pretty unsatisfactory in this country. Those are the days just before true democracy. Those are the days of isolation, of the world not liking South Africa because of our political setup. The light blue bars that follow that show us a much happier situation. Economic growth turned positive, remained positive for many, many years, and very importantly, by round about 10 years ago, in fact, roughly 10 years ago, we see that growth approached almost 6%. Unfortunately, from 2009 onwards, growth not only showed one negative growth year, but since then it has been declining. And this has actually become known for reasons which I don't think I'm going to dwell upon for the purpose of this exercise, but it's become known as the so-called lost years, the lost decade, as it were. The lost decade during from around about 2009 to 2010. Now, just to confirm what I'm saying here, and I think there we are. If you look at quarterly economic growth for the last roughly 5 years, it has been on many occasions negative, and indeed we got the news around about early March, late February, that the last quarter of 2019 had a negative growth rate, and that was the second in a row, which many of you will know signifies technically a recession. Unfortunately, as important as growth is, I think it's important to point out that the how much of growth is not as important as the how of economic growth. It's one thing having a growing economy. It's another thing seeing that translated into a better, if you like, quality of life, standard of living for the citizens. So although we've had growth on and off for quite some time, we also have a structurally high rate of unemployment. The official unemployment rate right now is around about 30%. And as this little graph is showing you, it has been at that kind of level for a long, long time. Even worse is the fact that the youth unemployment rate is 50% and more. And we have 3 million young people, those aged 15 to 24, who are classified as needs. Not employed, not in education, not in trade. To add to our problems, human development, not all that great. It's getting even better. But as you can see, our Human Development Index is barely 0.7 or 70 out of 100. It has been worse, but even so, it ranks us around about 119th in the world in terms of human development. Clearly, not good enough. We're not making our progress there. And many of you also know that South Africa is renowned for having one of the most uneven income and also wealth distributions on planet Earth. If you look very carefully, you'll see the red dots indicating the Gini coefficient, and at the moment, it's actually higher than what it was 25 years ago. So all in all, not a very good socioeconomic performance. What was also, and still does worry us more and more in the last number of years, has been the fact that our government debt has been growing. Now, the graph you see at the moment indicates that up until around about 2009, we had made magnificent progress in actually reducing the government debt. It went from 50% in the mid-1990s to barely 26% by 2008, 2009. Unfortunately, ever since then, it's been rising, and the latest prospects pre-virus indicate that in a few years' time, it'll be getting towards 70%. So, again, a problem because government's resources are really getting very tight and very limited. As it is, the 3 major credit rating agencies, the last one a few weeks ago being Moody's, have given this country junk bond rating. The graph you see now shows us that our savings ratio, total savings as a share of the economy, is barely 16%, far too low to finance the investment that we so desperately need for further economic growth. So, we put it all together, February of this year, we were in a technical recession. Global growth wasn't all that great. I'm afraid we have a number of education dysfunctionalities. Our education system is not delivering. We have a fiscal crisis. Household debt is quite high, unemployment high, high poverty, high inequality, and then to make matters even worse, our electricity supply organization wasn't able to guarantee the light stayed on for 24 hours a day. Our policy was uncertain, and labor was not being very productive. And yet, we've been saying for many, many years that we want to solve all these problems. We need an economic growth rate of at least 5% for 20 years in a row. If we don't get that, it's going to be difficult to really and seriously reduce unemployment, reduce poverty, and reduce inequality. And the challenge is made even more interesting because we have to achieve all of this in a very uncertain and a volatile global environment. So let us fast forward slightly. I'm going to skip this to save some time and say that as bad as the prospects were in February 2020, if only we had known what was about to happen, if only we had known what lay ahead in the next few days, actually. And this brings us then to, I'm not going to talk about the evolution of the virus in South Africa. What I'm going to say is that the latest figures indicate that around about 1,950 people have been formally tested as positive. We've had just less than 20 deaths. We've been in lockdown for the last 2 weeks, another 3 weeks to go, and already very clear signs, as one can imagine, as we see all over the world, that people are really, really starting to struggle, especially small businesses. Bear in mind that in South Africa, like many other parts of Africa and the developing world, that the so-called informal sector is a major source of employment and earnings for millions and millions of people. And for those people, economic life has virtually almost overnight come to a standstill. But to show you, and you've all seen this no doubt, some of the more frightening expectations for the global economy to start off with. Well-known Roux said a few weeks ago, the shock to the global economy from COVID-19 has been faster and more severe than the 2008 global financial crisis and even the Great Depression. Just a few hours ago, the World Trade Organization said that it expects world trade to plummet by 32%. It also said that we are facing the worst recession in our lifetimes. These are global realities. When translated to South Africa, I would argue that a typical, hopefully orthodox scenario kind of thinking, that there are two key uncertainties, two major key drivers that will make or break the future. The one has to do with the public health response. Now, of course, this is applicable in any country, but the nuances for South Africa are clearly different to those for, let's say, the USA or the UK and many other developed nations. Because in South Africa, for whatever reason, the public health response could be exclusive and ineffective. The reality is that on the top left-hand corner is what life is like for many, many millions of South Africans. They live in so-called townships or informal settlements. Some estimates are that at least half the population lives in such townships and informal settlements. If you have a very careful look at this photograph, you will probably note there's no formal electricity. There's no clean running water on the premises. Many people live in one of those small dwellings. And in terms of access to healthcare, in the rural parts of the country, for instance, that is the major access. Even in the built-up parts, in the townships, healthcare facilities are overburdened and under-resourced. Of course, the response will hopefully be more inclusive and more effective. But again, I want to highlight the contrast in the country. There's another photograph of South Africa, a totally different picture. I mean, what you see there is beautiful there. City, suburbs, lush grass, tennis courts, swimming pools, and access to state-of-the-art, world-class hospitals. So, as I was saying, a key issue is going to be the response of the health sector. The intentions so far have been, in my opinion, superb. Our president has been speaking to us regularly. Our Minister of Health has been speaking. We're on the right track in terms of intentions. We are yet to see whether the public health sector will be able to accommodate the possibility of thousands and thousands of people needing treatment and needing intensive care treatment. The other big story, for any country, but again, the nuances here are perhaps a bit different, is the nature of any economic stimulus. And the concern here is that the economic response by the authorities may be rather tepid and uninspired. Recently, the president and his ministers announced 12 measures, and I quote there, to cushion the economy. We are way beyond needing to just cushion the economy. We need actual, really aggressive, almost unorthodox, almost audacious stimuli. A recent calculation showed that the UK, France, and the USA, for instance, have injected resources totaling more between 11 and 20% of the GDP into their economies. Now, my calculations show that so far in South Africa, within barely 1%. So, put the two together, and we obviously think we come up with 4 different scenarios. And I must be honest, and it's not a very happy thing to say, that none of these scenarios is exciting. What we're hoping for is that the negative news, the negative outcome, the negative future is as the least negative one possible. So let's start with the bottom left-hand side. I'm again kind of borrowing a word used recently by Roux, where he talks about not just the Great Depression, but even perhaps an even greater depression. For South Africa, that's a situation where the public health response is just not there. The public health sector just collapses, it implodes. At the same time, economic stimulus is really hardly worth mentioning. That could plunge this country into a greater depression. Moving to the right, where there's a bit more success in terms of responding to the pandemic, but the long-term costs of the lockdown, the extended lockdown that will probably apply, are really so aggressive, so negative for the economy that we have perhaps a Great Recession, something similar to the Great Recession of 10 years ago, or perhaps a little worse than that. Top left-hand side is where the public health response is not all that great, but government does, and along with the private sector, does really get into it. They go in drawing all their weapons at their disposal in trying to keep the economy ticking over. That would imply a lengthy recovery and a patchy recovery. Some industries would recover slightly quicker than others. Top right-hand side is where the public health response is satisfactory and government does throw lots of money at the problem. Then the prognosis would be probably the one we were talking about 6 weeks ago, the February 2020 kind of prognosis, which is not all that great, but of these 4 different scenarios, that would be the best possible outcome. Here's a brief description of the 4 scenarios. And again, I'm borrowing the words partly of Roux, and then obviously the more traditional words used by other analysts. The Greater Depression would be an I-shaped economic cycle, a vertical line. Financial markets plummet, the real economy plummets, and already I've made the point already, this recession, this downturn, will be faster, more severe than even back during the Great Depression. The Great Recession on steroids. This is what, using the alphabet, as many people are, an L-shaped cycle. So the economy really does, or GDP does collapse, and then after a while, it starts moving sideways. This is where you've got a sharp downturn followed by a long stagnation. And along the way, almost permanent damage to the labor market. You think about unemployment again. Permanent damage to investment and permanent damage to some aspects of productivity. The lengthy and patchy recovery, that would be permanent loss of output in a number of businesses, sectors, or industries, and in particular, small businesses. A recent estimate, there's so many of these things, says over the next few months, if not weeks, up to 200,000 small businesses in this country might shut down forever and ever. In this scenario, real incomes only really start recovering in maybe 2 years' time. And then finally, the V-shaped recovery. That would be a sharp decline in the economy, a sharp recovery, but only coming back to where we were a few weeks ago, and that was not all that great, as I pointed out already. So I'm afraid, like in most places in the world, the story is obviously not a happy one. I think unlike many countries in the developed world, countries in Africa, South Africa is no exception, excuse me, are particularly vulnerable given the fact that so many millions of people are already living in some degree of poverty, earning low incomes, low wages, high levels of unemployment, high levels of inequality, it does make the situation for South Africa and others in Africa more desperate than many others. In conclusion, and it's a fairly lengthy conclusion, I asked the question, well, let's assume it is now 2 or 3 years down the road, the dust has settled to a large extent. What happens then to South Africa? And first of all, some generic thoughts, not just for South Africa, and there's nothing original about these thoughts, but I think it's fair to say the economic fallout will last for a number of years. Of course, what is particularly worrisome for the whole planet is the fact that, unlike most previous recessions, this one is a synchronized one. The rich countries and poor alike are experiencing this recession. Perhaps a contentious statement, but I hope it turns out to be a correct one. This is shattering the myth that the economy must always come first. We might see shifts in the global power balance or acceleration of shifts in the global power balance. A very interesting question that's been around in Africa for many, many years, actually, and that is, what is preferable, a functional autocracy or a dysfunctional democracy? Obviously, one would like to have a functional democracy, but given this choice, what looks better for countries in Africa? Are we going to see more nationalism, or are we going to see a return to global trade? Are we going to see more connectedness amongst countries and people, or are we going to see an even further retreat to isolationism, protectionism, populism, and nationalism? That's a positive thing, and that is we have already seen innovations arising to try to combat COVID-19. And maybe we'll see something that we saw during the Second World War. Not that one in any way would like to support the idea of war, but maybe this is going to force some interesting new innovations. This global supply chain is going to be impacted significantly. And of course, the supply chain influences and impacts everything and anybody. Clearly, energy access, we are seeing again, saves lives. Those things we've taken for granted for so often, for so long in the so-called Western world, are often sadly lacking in the developing world. It's almost saying back to basics. In times of trouble, in times of catastrophe, regardless of how advanced we are technologically, nothing is more important than food, water, energy, etc. And of course, I'm sure many people have and will talk about this for a long, long time. This is going to herald a new world of work, and new implications for transport, and indeed a new way of conducting meetings. What's going to happen to international air travel, and many similar related questions. For South Africa, looking beyond just, as I said, the current cycle, what lies ahead? What kind of future can we try to imagine for South Africa in, let's say, the year 2030? In fact, taking its time on the 10th of April. And I would argue that there are 7 tipping points that will have a bearing on the country's future. By that I mean, perhaps I'm using the word rather poetically, but issues that will either plunge this country into further decay, or, if managed correctly, lift us out of the current and even the pre-pandemic sluggishness. And these 7 tipping points are becoming more competitive in the global economy, dealing with a democratic surplus. Now, this is an interesting debate, especially in many African countries, including South Africa. Essentially, what I'm getting at here is that for many South Africans, democracy has advanced rapidly. That economic development, less so. So we have people are far more democratic, so it seems, than ever before. But for many people, this has not been matched by economic progress in this creates a disequilibrium. And obviously, when there's a disequilibrium, forces try to restore that equilibrium. And while those forces are trying to restore equilibrium, you could see lots of friction in society. Maybe I should add there that as it is, in the last number of years, there have been up to 3 or 4 bigger or smaller, what we call service delivery protests in different parts of the country, as many people, many South Africans express their dismay, their resentment about the lack of service delivery. Then, of course, I think we all know that social capital is a key ingredient. It's pointless having a good education, a good science, even good economy, if we don't have goodwill and tolerance and social cohesion. Skills. I could spend hours talking about this one alone. All I'm going to say here is that, unfortunately, for historical reasons, as well as more recent reasons, our education system is not creating the right kind of skills for the economy that South Africa now has. Many people think that South Africa's economy is all about gold and other forms of mining. That is no longer the case. That still happens. But our entire primary sector, which is mining and agriculture, makes up only about 10% of the economy. 70% is the form of services. But unfortunately, our education system is largely producing people with skills that are more, I suppose, related towards a primary and perhaps a secondary sector economy. To put this in very practical terms, after years of improvement since 1994, we still find that roughly 1/4 of adults in this country have no more than 7 years of education. Then savings, I mentioned already, we need more savings. Very importantly, one of the, I suppose, hallmarks of this country's post-94 era was the jealous protection of the autonomy of our democratic institutions. There's something called a public protector. We have a central bank, a reserve bank, we call it, auditor general, the judiciary, etc. And for a number of years, we were very proud of both the autonomy of these institutions and the integrity and the competence. Unfortunately, from around about 2009, for the next 8 or 9 years, this autonomy was compromised. And then finally, again, very controversial, we have a youthful population. Will that turn out to be a demographic dividend or a demographic disaster? Now, I've not got time, and I won't bore you with the discussion of each one of these in any detail. I'm quickly going to flash through a few slides now and rush on to my final conclusion. Sorry, I've gone too quickly now. So let's go back a few. And that is that of these 7 tipping points that I just briefly mentioned, and this is still work in progress, to be perfectly honest, but doing a few sort of cross-impact analyses, it does appear as if the 2 on the left-hand side are the really important ones, the active levers, the ones that, if they are addressed, are so important that they could help to at least co-resolve those on the right-hand side. The 2 on the left are generating sufficient skills and restoring the autonomy of our democratic institutions. And using those 2, again, as a kind of a scenario exercise, there you see it on the horizontal axis, we're talking about skills, and along the vertical axis, we're talking about our institutions. And 4 scenarios, gold at the end of the rainbow. That is a wonderful world, an ideal, idealized future where our skills are competitive, globally competitive and appropriate, and our institutions are restored to their previous form of glory. Bottom left-hand side, I call winter of discontent. Skills levels remain inappropriate, our institutions go from bad to worse. Bottom right-hand side, there's a phrase in English, an Indian summer, which refers to a situation where it's actually autumn or winter, and suddenly for a couple of days you have some glorious weather. That's very short. And then top left-hand side, skills level remains inappropriate. Our institutions get better, in which case I'm calling that hope springs eternal. I shall have a look at the brief outline of the two extreme scenarios here. Let's start with the worst one. Let's get that out of our systems. Winter of discontent. This would be a country, a South Africa, where rent-seeking behavior prevails among senior politicians and also possibly senior business leaders. Pockets of prosperity, vigilantes and warlords, a very divided society. The Dutch disease, all we do is we dig up our natural resources and sell them in that raw form to other countries. We have to import most of our manufactured goods as well as capital goods. Growth is elitist. The skills divide, the digital divide get wider and wider. Excuse me, government starts panicking. They borrow money to throw money at the problem, and it doesn't solve the problem at all. People start paying tax, and ultimately the government loses total control. Gold at the end of the rainbow is where all the major stakeholders sit around a table, in manner of speaking, and reach some kind of social pact. There we are. We protect those democratic institutions jealously. There's far more social capital, tolerance, goodwill, cohesion, more accountability. We use our natural resources and add value to them. Skills are appropriate. We become more competitive. Entrepreneurs are really given their rightful place in society, especially small entrepreneurs, small business. They're the ones that should be driving economic revival. Our tax base gets bigger, not by raising taxes, but simply because it's a bigger tax base, and government spending is sensible and is used primarily to support those who are still struggling to become part of the formal economy. It's a very gloomy story. I thought I would like to end off by pointing out that amidst all the current gloom and doom, there are still some very important positives. I would almost say structural positives in this country. One is we are an upper middle income economy. Secondly, and this many people might find surprising, certainly in this country they do, out of 218 economies, we are the 29th largest in the world. Not the 29th richest or happiest, but in terms of production, 29th biggest in the world. Our financial infrastructure is truly sophisticated and respected. We have a diversified economy. Our central bank, and I'm not paid to say this, is doing, I think, a wonderful job, has been for a number of years, in sometimes difficult circumstances. Incidentally, another positive emanating from that is that interest rates in this country are still, by international standards, fairly high, around about 5.5% to 6%. That means we still have quite a lot of scope, if needs be, to lower interest rates. As you know, in many other countries in the developed world, interest rates are probably at all-time low. Not much scope any further relief there. We have that youthfulness I've mentioned, and we are resilient. We've gone through tough times in the past, and somehow managed to escape and come out a little bit wiser and not too battered and bruised. I'm really going to end off now. Many of you might recognize this quote. It struck me when preparing for this that not 10 years ago, after the Great Recession, or reflecting upon the Great Recession, Thomas Friedman said something then. I've taken the liberty of taking the same words with one or two slight adjustments. He said, and you'll see there where I've changed, where you see red words and then deletions, that's how subtly changed his initial quote. So let's today step out of the normal boundaries of analysis of our economic crisis and ask the radical question: what if the COVID-19 crisis represents something much more fundamental than a deep recession. And he went on to answer this. What it was telling us that the whole growth model we created in the last 50 years is simply unsustainable economically and ecologically. And that 2020 was when we hit the wall, when Mother Nature and the market both said, no more. I'll have my own words. Take a breather, smell the roses, smell the coffee, relax. Let's think about these things. Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama's chief of staff, when reflecting upon the Great Recession, said, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And again, one would hope that as humanity, we learn something meaningful from the current crisis we're experiencing. And this really is my last slide. Not surprisingly, in the last few days and weeks, people have been asking me, as they normally do, what does the future look like? And I keep on giving them my standard answer, and that is, what do you want it to look like? On that note, I think I've said enough. I've gone slightly over my time, I believe, Manuel, but I have not gone over the hours time slot.